Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the ESSER guidance session. My name is Wendy Fons. I'm the ESSER Director for the State of Montana, Office of Public Instruction. And with me today is also Rebecca Brown, the Program Manager.
Hi, everyone.
So we're very excited to have you be a part of this training today. We do have these guidance sessions on a monthly basis. We try and keep them around the third of each month, but sometimes due to holidays, we have them earlier. But they are Monday through Friday, the variety of topics that are available, and they are recorded. So all of the sessions, then you can go back and review those if you wish through going to the OPI website, the ESSER button on the right-hand side, and then going down to guidance, frequently asked questions section. There's a whole training section that's available there. Today's topic is new superintendent and clerk tips and guidance, and the focus is on ESSER grant, the ESSER 1, 2, and 3. I will note that we have had some technical challenges in the morning session, so if we end up with some technical challenges, you may only be able to hear my voice, and we will also then just have the slides, and we'll go through the slides. So hopefully that will work, but do let us know in the chat session if it's not coming through on your end. To start with, I'd like to ask how many of you have seen us or spoken with Rebecca or I in either an email format or through phone. That sort of helps us gauge, are we able to be reaching out to new superintendents? Is there a different mode that we need to use? And gives us just an indication of how this communication is working on the training session. So if you could put that into the chat session, that would be great. Also, as we go along, feel free to put into the chat session any questions that you have. At the end of the session, we will have a Q&A specific time, but we're perfectly willing to stop at any point and try and answer your questions as we go through the slides themselves. There is a delay that occurs when you type. So it's about a 15-second after you submit before we actually see them. So just note that that is in that process. There may be a little bit of a delay. Okay, next slide, please. So our contact information, we want to make sure that you have that information going forward. Our emails and our phone numbers are there. I really encourage you that email is wonderful, but sometimes it can be a little confusing in terms of explaining your particular situation. So don't hesitate to give me a call or give Rebecca a call. That number is listed for you for that purpose. If you can send an email ahead of time that then we can reference when we're speaking to you, that's extremely helpful. If you're able to put into the subject line, this is the district, this is my LE number, that helps reference us as to where and who you are before we have the phone conversation. But by all means, don't hesitate to use our phones. Those are available for you. Next slide, please. So as we go forward, this is some of the content that, some additional contact information that you can look at. Steve Morgan is the person who is the grant accountant, and he does a lot of the cash requests and the final expenditure reports. And Mindy is all things ESSER, that I like to say. She is really an expert in ESSER in many ways, and specifically with e-grants. She actually managed the ESSER 1 part of this grant to begin with. So she's a good resource as well as Rebecca and I. Next slide, please. What we're going to be covering today are a couple of items, starting with grant compliance, school finance, ESSER Overview. So what is this particular grant? We're going to talk a little bit about pre-approval process on those items that are large. We're going to go through some e-grant processing queues, and there are some separate cash request and amendment specific guidance videos that you can look at as well, but we're going to do an overview. And then we're going to talk about grant tracking and also about how do you look at your monthly allocations and status reports. Next slide, please. So when we talk about school finance, this is an important thing for superintendents and clerks, is just looking at what is available on the OPI website for you to look at to see where the financing is. And there are a couple of tabs you can look at. So if you go to our sort of standard homepage for the Office of Public Instruction, Under finance, you will find a variety of different colored tabs, those sort of colored tabs down there that indicate different categories of funding that you might want to look at. And there's just a tremendous amount of information there. If we go now to the hyperlink for the quick guide, this is a really nice guide that says, as a new superintendent or a new clerk, what are the things that I might want to change based on the fact that I'm new? So a lot of grant funding and processing occurs in a e-grant portal or some other kind of financial software, and you do have to have authorized representative access. So you have to have a password and a username. And if you're coming in as a new superintendent or a new clerk, you may have received this already, but it's a good checklist. So you might want to take this link once you see these slides on your side and just click through them and say, yep, I've done this part. I've done the e-grants. I've done it the county side. I've done the OPI contacts, and just double check that those items have indeed been updated with your specific information. We have a couple of the links on here for you to look at, the OPI contact and the central update contacts. But again, that first page that just has a list is a good resource to use. Next slide. So I'm going to give you sort of an overview of ESSER itself, and I think this is an important place to start. At a national level, we received $189.5 billion under the ESSER COVID funding, relief funding that was going to the schools. And Montana received $605 million. And that was split out into 3 separate grants. While they are all tagged under the name of ESSER, they did actually have different components to them. So ESSER 1 is CARES, and it expires in 2022, this year. ESSER 2, or CARISA, expires in 2023. And ESSER 3, or ARP, expires in 2024. So each one of those grants expires on a different date, different year. And they also have slightly different compliances, but very similar. So that's why they're all called ESSER. When you're processing all of them, you do want to keep in mind the prepare, prevent, respond for all of them. The guidance and training sessions that are specific give you a little bit more detail of how those are different or how they were allocated, why your district got a certain amount and another district got another amount. You can review the August 9th and the September 20th recordings of those sessions. I'm going to pause here for a second and just ask, are there any questions about how those 3 different grants work at this point? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to the next slide. So just a brief overview again of e-grants. These are some topics that you might want to look at in terms of processing e-grants, which is where all of those ESSER 1, 2, and 3 processing grant information is contained. And you can look at error messages, you can look at processing, cash requests, amendments, and then just generally navigating e-grants. It's a pretty large federal program that manages grants. Next slide. So one tip when you're using e-grants is to really make sure that you have your pop-up blockers off. And before you dive into any one of these potential solutions is to check with your IT department and make sure that the way that you're turning it off is the way that they want you to turn it off. The reason why you need to have pop-up blockers are off is when you do any kind of processing with ESSER funds, when you're doing an amendment or a cash request, you have to be able to have more than one screen open at a time. So as you go into the application, it will pull out information to a second tab. And that pull out requires that your pop-up blockers be off. So these are just 3 quick solutions for that if you can't get access to something. Now, one of the places that this is most important is when you are doing your plan updates. So there are 3 parts to compliance. And I'm going to leave this screen for the pop-up blockers on because I think it's important in all of these portals, the things I'm going to talk about. For compliance on e-grants, there is a plan, which is called the Safe Return. There is an ARP plan, which is use of funds. And there's also the data collection. All three of those come into different types of portals, and they all really need to have this pop-up blocker off, or it can cause problems. It's not 100% that it will, but in all three of those formats, including e-grants, the pop-up blockers are something that sometimes cause a problem. So again, just wanted to mention this as a resource for you. Next slide, please. So when we go into eGrants, there's several different ways to go in. You can go into eGrants by going to the OPI website, and then you do any of the drawdowns from those educator, leadership, finance tabs, and there's a little spot that says eGrants. It's in gray, and that yellow band is showing it. When you go into that, you will then have the eGrants login screen, or the home page, which is this red and blue and light blue screen. And I want to point out a couple of important areas here. So on the far right, it's got log on, and it's got your username and password. And that's that part that you need to be an authorized representative or a clerk or identified in some means in the eGrant system as an authorized person to go in and look at your material or to make modifications in your grant. But on the left-hand side under announcements, equally important is a section that says announcements. So sometimes there are updates that have to be done in eGrants, and you may be trying to log in and you're not able to get into the system at all. After you've tried at least 2 times, I would recommend that you come to this announcement section and just see, is eGrants being updated? Because sometimes it's not that you're typing in the wrong number or the wrong email address. It's just that there's an update being done and you can't get in. Secondly, you'll see in the middle, there's a training section, and that does contain some information about how to change your password, how to do amendments. There's some good handouts in that. And so that's, again, another section that's good to look at. Next screen. So this is when you go into eGrants, this is the contact information page, and some of it may be blacked out, or in this case, grayed out. And the reason for that is these applications, ESSER 1, 2, and 3, are anchored on a particular date. And if you are if you're coming in the second or third year of a grant, the information is already being pulled in. And so it may not show the previous individuals who started the application itself. But you do want to check under new applications that you set up that the information is correct, because the email addresses and the phone numbers that we use to send you notices are all coming from within eGrants. So it's an important thing if you say to us, well, I never received notification that an amendment was returned. We want to be able to go in and look at, is the email address correct? Was there an S instead of a T, for example? And those little changes, unfortunately, eGrants is not sophisticated enough to figure that out. So we just always have to check this spot. It's a good place to always look at your contact information. Next page. Under the contact information, you're going to see a security change section, and it will allow you to change what your security is. And periodically, eGrants, I think it's every 90 days, will ask you to make a change, so that you might have to go in there and change it just on a regular basis. Generally, you have to enter in the information with your authorized representative email as a standard contact information. We have had some questions about, can we have more than one authorized representative? And for each of the grants, there is a authorized representative. You can change that, but you can't put in 2 or 3 authorized representatives as like a backup. So that you can't do. There is a spot to enter in summer contact information, which could be different than the school year. So that does give you a little bit of flexibility there. Next screen. On the welcome page, again, the other thing I wanted to point out in here is that we do have, again, some training handout information and your password. If you have forgotten your password, you do want to, you can update it by just saying you forgot. But again, make sure that you have the pop-up blockers available, because that will be affected by what is sent back to you on the forgot your password. Next screen. The next thing we want to look at when you're going into e-grants to start processing your grant, if you are, a new superintendent coming in or a new clerk, you want to look at the year as a drop down or a starting point for these grants. And what's important to understand is that the date that is listed for the selection of the year isn't the date that we're in right now. So you wouldn't be putting in 2022, you'd be putting in the year that the grant was opened. And so a little bit of keeping, ESSER 1 was started in 2019, 20, and ESSER Consolidated, which is really ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 Consolidated, which is really ESSER 3, were done in 2021. So you can kind of make your own chart. Unfortunately, the naming of these is outside of our area. It's brought in. This is eGrants is a federal program, and we can't go in and change the names of these grants. When we received one, we didn't know we were going to get 2 and 3, so the naming convention isn't matching. We do apologize for that. Next slide. So then you will see when you're looking at tracking the budgets that what you'll see is some ability to look at amendments and go in and say, all right, where am I in this process? Which grant am I in? So that's going to be the first place. And then what amendment am I looking at? So amendments, these grants are very different than normal grants in that you get to make amendments. So many grants, you submit a plan and you say, this is what I'm planning to do with the funds. And then later, you're not able to change, even if you get additional funding to secure part of your grant. With ESSER, you get to make an amendment. So you can start off, someone 3 years ago who was a superintendent and the school board at that time could have said, we are going to expand our science classroom. And then you come along and you have a new school board and you're a superintendent and the business clerk. And in talking to your current families in the community, they say, well, a science lab was great, but we got another grant to cover that. Now we'd like to use the ESSER funds for an after-school program to help with college and career programming, or to do literacy and reading, those types of things. So those are things that you actually have the ability to do amendments. And that's a really nice thing about this grant. Because of that, your plans that you do. So remember, I talked about sort of the compliance of the safe return plan, the ARP ESSER plan, and the data compliance. Because you're able to do amendments, you're able to change what you are going to use those funds for. Those plans and the data reporting afterwards is a little bit more complicated. So we're going to show you in a few minutes some ways to track those amendments and how you spend those funds. So we'll go to the next screen. So this is a screen that helps you print your information. And there are 2 pieces to printing which are important. So again, when you're looking at an amendment, you're entering this information into eGrants, which is a very large federal grant program. It's not like having your little laptop that then allows you to do Excel nice changes in it. This is a very big program and it's rather cumbersome. So printing, doing things like screenshots is important, but maybe you want to print a lot of your changes, and you can do that in eGrants. One thing you do need to keep in mind is that the prints are happening on an hourly basis. So if you select print right now, the actual printed document isn't going to come to you until 4 o'clock. So there is a delayed piece, and I have had business clerks call me and say, oh, something really funny happened. I went in and I printed once and it didn't work. So I printed it a couple more times. And when I came in this morning, I looked in eGrants and I had 7 prints. And that's why, because it just queues them up. So just be aware of the fact that you can go in and choose to print the entire section or the entire grant, but there is a delay process. So sometimes those screenshots, I think, work a little better than doing the whole project or the whole view of the grant itself. Next screen, please. So when you do the drop down and look at the award notifications, this is a screen that shows you again, you select the year, and then there is a grant award notification that comes to you. And it would probably not come to you because if you're a new superintendent or a clerk, you wouldn't have been there when the first application came in, but you might want to look at it. So when you first go into eGrants, you'll see a screen that looks like this. And then you can look under status and it'll say view GAN or grant award notification. And you can just choose that to pull it up. You might want to keep that as part of your records for if you get audited, it sort of shows here's my anchorage on what this grant looked like at the beginning. And that's kind of that first view. It's a very high level view. It doesn't give you tons of detail, but it does give you some. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pre-approval of items in eGrants. These are things that are larger than 5,000. So it could be an item like a copier, or it could be a project like you're going to upgrade all of the network connectivity in your school or district. It could be either one of those. And really the pre-approval process is just creating a project scope that identifies who should be contacted in case there's information about the project that you might need because you're going to do an amendment and you want to say, well, we're not going to do an HVAC system in 2 of the schools. We're only going to do them in 1. So that project scope is just a document that you can edit on your side. But it also identifies not just the description of the product of the project or item, but also identifies very specifically what are the gains that students will receive, and really anchoring on that prepare, prevent, and respond language. And then again, anchoring on it's preparing or preventing as it relates to students. So we might say that we're going to add an extension to a building to reduce spread of infection, but really what that's doing is increasing attendance. So you're reducing absenteeism of students in order to increase attendance to gain more academic or social emotional learning that occurs within the school. So you really sort of have to anchor on that. What is the student gain? In some of the projects, you will need to do alternatives. So if an auditor comes and looks at your pre-approved project scope, they might say, well, why did you add on 2 HVAC systems instead of 3? Or why did you buy this HVAC system? Or did you have bids for all of these? Did you meet the compliance, the federal guidelines for having bids? And it's a document that sort of tracks all of that. The scope document, again, is just a Word document that you create. It's very flexible. And then you upload that into a pre-approval Google Sheets document, Google Form document, and check off and review the compliances. So it's sort of those 2 places that you do information. Going forward, the project scope, you can literally just pull pieces out and use those as part of your amendments and your cash requests so that they all get tied together. And that way, if an auditor comes through, they can look at your plan, your initial plan that you were using. They can look at your GAN or your grant award notification. Then they can look at your amendments, and this pre-approval form would be part of that. And again, when we look at the plans themselves, those plans probably were created prior. Again, if you're a new superintendent or a business clerk, those would have been created prior to your coming on board. And so those plans, there is a review process that is required at least twice a year, at least every 6 months. And you go in and do the updates on those. And then the data collection happens every year through the federal government coming and asking OPI to prepare a report for all the districts. So that data collection side of things will be coming about this year, probably in January through March, and we'll be sending out more information on that. So I know that's a little bit challenging as to how all of those go together. We do have different work sessions, different guidance sessions that talk about each of those specifically, but the compliances are the plans and the data collection. And then the processing that you do in e-grants really ties all of those together. And that's how they kind of get connected. And keeping all that documentation together really helps. Next slide, please. So looking at the plans as we have here, the Safe Return and the ARP ESSER plans, there are different portals that you can go in to get access to this. They are maintained differently. And again, we've got the YouTube website that you can look at our September in-depth training on that. We will also really be talking about the meaningful stakeholder consultation later on tomorrow. And so that is part of those plan requirements, and you can look at that information as well. Next slide, please. The data collection is an annual process. It does require the stakeholder engagement as part of the plans, and we will be sending out more information about the data collection as soon as we know about it. Unfortunately, the Department of Education has just not told us what that will look like right now. We are anticipating that we will be sending out a data collection form in probably one of two formats, and then we will move forward with assisting you as the district's superintendents and also business clerks in how to fill that out. Unfortunately, we just don't know what that's going to look like. Otherwise, I'd share more information with you on that. What you can do to help prepare for that is to do that tracking of expenditures. You can track them in Excel or in a Sheets. You can identify student gains, and you can review your expenditures on a quarterly basis. So you can kind of go back and say, where do these fit together? Where have I spent my funds so far? And how are they being used going forward? Those tend to be the two questions that the Department of Ed has asked in the past. They have tended to say, did you spend ESSER funds in this category? Did you spend ESSER funds for paras? Did you spend ESSER funds for after-school programming? And then do you plan to spend in the future ESSER funds for summer enrichment? And it was a yes or no or true or false answer. This coming year, we anticipate that they're going to ask how much money or what percentage of the funds were spent in those categories. So it's going to be a slightly different ask. The Office of Public Instruction is going to pull as much information as we have about districts already and produce that into an Excel sheet to give back to you and say, is this accurate? Is this an accurate view from your perspective? We anticipate about 70% of the data we can do that to. 30% of the data we just won't have. So we will need to ask you to fill in that extra part. And again, as soon as we know more about it, we will definitely let you know about it. I'm going to take a pause right now and see if there are any questions on either the e-grant processing or the plan compliance and data. We're going to dive a little bit further. Will they extend ESSER 3? Very good question. Thank you for asking that. So right now, ESSER 1 did have an extension liquidation available to districts under certain situations and under a appeal process. We have asked multiple times, so is that going to be true also of 2 and 3? And unfortunately, they have not answered us. It's a pretty detailed Excel type appeal process. It has a lot of pieces to it. We do have that on our website under the frequently asked questions specific section. So you can look at that. There have been some guesses as to whether or not that model will be followed with 2 and 3. And I really hesitate to say yes or no on that because they just haven't given us any direction and we have asked several times. So again, as soon as we know, we will definitely let you know. Are there any other questions on that? Okay, next slide, please. So just now, an overview of tracking the grant with internal bookkeeping. We're going to again go through this, but in October, we had a more detailed view of the tracking process. So next slide. So there's a allocation and status report, which is generated every month by the Office of Public Instruction. And I think that's a really good place to start. If you are starting at the OPI website, on the far right-hand side, there is an ESSER tab, and underneath that, you'll see this ESSER resources, and then an accordion that drops down with allocations and status updates. So we're going to dive into that for just a minute. If we can switch to that. We're going to go back a slide and see if we can hyperlink to that opi.gov ESSER. There we go. And we're going to come down and we're going to go down to, and go ahead and select the trustee view for October. So this is a status update. And if we scroll down just a little bit, you will see for each school district, you will be receiving, the trustees will receive, this is the amount that you had for ESSER 1, for ESSER 2, and ESSER 3, and it'll show you the amount budgeted and the amount expended. So think of the budgeted amount as that amount that was allocated to you, and then you have an expenditure and what the status is. If we then go back to look at the district view, so that was at a trustee view. So now if we look at the district overview, this gives us a little bit more detail in looking at, go one slide down. There we go. And I think probably if we can, expand a little bit. This will give you a little bit greater view to look at on a quarterly basis. You could go in on a monthly basis and look at, for your district, how are those funds being used? So are they being used to address learning loss? Is it an indirect cost? Is it mental health, technology? And it gives you that within each of the two grants, and shows you what that expenditure, what the allocation expenditure, and then the balance. One point to keep in mind on these more detailed views is that this is a view on a monthly basis looking back a month. And so it's sort of like at the end of October. So if you were to look right now and maybe you submitted 2 or 3 cash requests on technology, that might show a different balance because they haven't occurred yet. They haven't been posted to the report. And the beginning page of that report itself gives you, again, that high level view for the entire state. So when you look at this, you can tell the entire state, we've only spent about 19% or 20% of the full amount. So there's quite a bit left that hasn't been spent by most districts, as opposed to one, we've spent pretty much all of it. And there may actually be all of it spent because we're in the middle of a month and that hasn't been reported out. Any questions on those two views? So again, that's looking at the trustee view and looking at the district view. Okay, we'll go back to the slides. So again, just sort of in tracking and looking at where funds are and the use of those funds, it's a good idea to go in and look at the overall allocation from the OPI site. I will say that if you do end up with something that is a discrepancy, you feel that there should be more money or there should be less money, please let us know. We try and deal with those issues up front. We don't want to be waiting until September when you're having to do the final expenditure report to discover that there was a discrepancy that occurred 6 months prior. So just look at these reports kind of on an ongoing basis, both at the allocation, the expenditure, and the remaining balance on all of them. Next slide, please. So in addition to that sort of high level tracking of allocation and balance, really looking at a little bit more detail at your district level is using an Excel spreadsheet. And we were very fortunate to have Jolene from Corvallis, who is a business clerk there with lots of experience, having her share last month her Excel tracking sheet. And we have that available on our website. You can link into it. And she was gracious enough to let us share that out. And it's very helpful in terms of just tracking your information. It's not something that you have to do, but it is something that may help you both track your expenditures, but also when we get into the data collection And we're asked not, did we spend the money in this category or that category, but literally how much did we spend in those categories. You'll have an easier time pulling that information out. And that information this is a nice worksheet to use going forward. Next slide, please. A couple of tips just in terms of overview of what we've covered would be to print your grant award notice from eGrants and sort of keep that in a folder. You can keep it in a hard copy folder or on your system itself. It's a good document to have for your auditors. Probably printing out your original budget that came in from eGrants. That's a nice place to have that. And then also using an Excel grant workbook or worksheet from Excel or Google Sheets, any of those mechanisms to track your expenditure is a good idea. Your cash requests or your amendments, cash requests, you can view within eGrants. You can print those out also. I was just working with a district this afternoon, and we just pulled up, here's what the amendments, the last 3 amendments had been, put them into a Word document, and they were able to save them as sort of a historical tracking for them, which I think is a nice way to do that. You can also do that on your cash requests. In any kind of a Excel tracking system, it's good to have a notes field so that you can enter in just some extra things. One of the things that Jolene shared out was the fact that frequently we'll get a phone call that interrupts us in what we're doing. And so just kind of tagging out there in that note column that, oh, I've got to come back to this worksheet here because this is what I was doing. And that anchors on where that processing was when you were sidetracked to go do the phone number or the phone call. And so that's a good, I always say, just add that extra column on the end of any worksheets. I usually call it a comment column, but a notes, a column, something to that effect to help you identify some extra tracking that you may need and have for a historical basis. Next slide, please. This is, again, another view of this. One of the things she was sharing is that she has different tabs for each of the different grants. So again, ESSER, we tend to think of it as all being one grant, but actually there's an ESSER 1, an ESSER 2, and an ESSER 3, and they are actually distinct grants, even though the compliances for them are very, very similar. Next slide. Couple of tips with regards to Excel, which I think are useful, are the way you sort. So you can use filters to sort within a column. And you can also use the plus, which is down at the bottom, to add additional sheets. One note when you're adding additional sheets at the bottom is to name those right at the beginning, because otherwise you can end up with multiple sheets that may not have a name and you're trying to figure out, what sheet or which tab actually had the information that you were working on. So just a good idea to add those in. If you are inheriting a tracking system and that hasn't been done, try and give it, again, some kind of a name. You can rename them. So that's a nice feature in Excel. Next slide, please. In terms of data entry into Excel, one of the things that's important, and also in Mayfair's, is leading zeros or where those zeros occur. And so you can use an apostrophe to help with that. So an example would be 0731 reverts to 731 in Excel. And if you use the apostrophe, it will hold that 0 up front for you. So just another little tip in there in terms of adding in zeros up front. Or if your LE number you want to enter in for a variety of different reasons, often those LE numbers, your entity number is a 0. It begins with a 0. Next slide, please. So just in closing, I wanted to show you again our OPI website homepage. And on the right-hand side, you will see an ESSER button that you can use to get a tremendous amount of information in there. There are lots of different drop downs and information from these guidance sessions. Both the slide decks and the audio and visual are there as well. And you can also use the broadband button down at the bottom on those same blues to give you information about another grant or a series of grants that are coming about for the state of Montana on broadband. So trying to get our our schools really up to speed, as it were, on internet access. So that concludes our presentation today at sort of a very high level on these big topics of ESSER, the compliance, which are the plans, the safe return, and the ARP ESSER plan, and the data compliance, and then the processing, which is in e-grants and utilizes amendments and cash requests and that pre-approval process. Are there any questions?